When we're talking about the British Empire, though, we're talking more specifically in the generation of 1815 to about 1915, ending with more or less the First World War, which was really, in a lot of senses, the end of empire, or the end of empire as it had been seen. And that's a good point to end our steampunk as well, because at that point we start to get into diesel punk and other forms of technological advancement. And again, this is all tracking the real world, and we don't have to really pay too much attention to the variations of that, because if we have a steampunk world that is not the real world, many of the conditions that exist there will exist as they had been, or at least in terms of industry itself. It wasn't just in their own citizens that the British Empire's imperialism was causing widespread suffering. I mean, you have as well in India, for example, the East India Company, which had caused a lot of problems in China with the Opium Wars and basically mandating that the empire behave in a way that was appropriate to British needs. You also had what they were doing in India. In fact, the problems in India began when the East India Company was dissolved by the Crown, and India became basically India became. It was not a state, it was not an entity before the British essentially dissolved the company and gave it to the Queen. The Queen became the Empress of India. India was suddenly a separate thing. All of these previously separate countries were administrated as one thing. And so the English started to develop India, not for the sake of making it an industrialized country, but to make it more efficient to draw the wealth out of India. They built a lot of railroads, but those railroads were pretty much to take resources from their points of origin to the ports. And this isn't new either. This isn't just Britain doing this. This is just the nature of empire. You go back to Rome, the Roman roads, much of the same general function. Make it more efficient to draw wealth from the exterior parts of the empire to the center. Speaking of China, there was a lot of the same sort of imperial business going on just a century earlier. The Manchu and the native Han had a similar sort of acrimonious relationship, and to the point where to destroy the natives Han cultural identity, the Manchu mandated the haircut, the quay, bald at the top. That was entirely foisted upon them by the Manchu rulers of China at the time. And you saw something similar in the US in the 19th century with the Native Americans. Native American tribes, many of them saw the long hair of the braves, in the Southwest in particular, of the braves and the shamans as being holy. If you cut your hair among the Zuni, for example, it was considered you were defiled. So what's the first thing they do? They cut their hair. They bring them in, they send them to the Indian schools where they learn Western culture to destroy their own cultural heritage. This happened, like I said, everywhere. Every human society does this sort of thing. There's always the in-group, which is in power, and the out-group, which is exploited in some way or another. And steampunk is an excellent lens to view this sort of exploitation through. I'm not saying all steampunk has to be about dreary social issues. You know, it's something to be aware of while you're coming up with your stories. Something to be aware of when you're considering the nature of how the upper classes in whatever culture you're considering got to be where they are. It's something to keep at the very least in the back of your head. In my own stories, I deal with it in a somewhat indirect way. When I started writing in 2011, I was unemployed, basically homeless. I was couch surfing, and I was unable to find a job for quite some time. I was in dire straits, not the band, just in general. So I took to what was available to me at the time, which was self-publishing. I started writing in a bunch of different genres, steampunk among others, using a bunch of different pen names. Steampunk was the genre that happened to take off, and it happened to be the one that my real name was attached to. So as it did, I just happened to find that audience that was welcoming enough and interested enough in what it was that I was writing. And it was born of necessity as much as anything else. But when I began writing, I did not know. I was aware of the steampunk scene. I went to events. I dressed in clothes when I had them. Well, most of the time I was dressed in clothes. But I mean steampunk-specific clothes when I had them available. But I wasn't as aware of many of the issues that I now write about. And that's one of the problems when you're a writer, is that your earliest work is your most clueless work and your least skillful work, and that's what most people will find when they look it up. Your first books are what they go for. But at the same time, as I continued writing the steampunk fiction, I added more and more nuance. I mean, my first few steampunk books were set in London, because, what do you think of when you think of steampunk? Oh, well, Victorian London. And I didn't really explore the rest of the possible stuff. I didn't explore a lot of the issues involved. I had some idea, because I was interested in history, what was going on, and I tried to weave that into what I was doing. But there's such a great potential for story there, because what I mentioned earlier, the eternal conflict between those who benefit from the status quo and those who are trying to change it. And that's really the essence of drama, and the essence of story is conflict. So that where you can mine for conflict, and tasteful, and where you can develop your personal stories, your personal, the issues you choose to address, is how you grow as a creative professional of any kind, writer or otherwise. If I look through the books that I've written, the first few they didn't have the same level of development. They relied heavily on steampunk tropes. Airships. Why airships? Well, because airships are steampunk. Gears. Why gears? Because, stick some gears in it. Called steampunk. The color brown. Why brown? Because cyberpunks discovered brown, and that's where steampunk came. These old jokes are so true in a certain sense when you have a very surface level understanding of what you're dealing with. And that was, in the beginning, my understanding of steampunk. Very, very surface level. But as you deal with it, and as you sort of develop your personal canon, you have these opportunities that you can either take or you can, avoid, to have your stories go somewhere deep. And you don't necessarily have to. I mean, that's your choice as an artist, what you want to present, what stories you want to tell. But there's always that conscious choice you're making, whether or not you want to tell a greater story. You don't have to be obvious and preachy about it, like this presentation here. You can be a little more subtle, a little more, a little more careful with it. Just seed the elements in as you go along, and that's how you reach people. You reach people by entertaining them, you reach people by educating them, but it's not, a hammer. It's just sort of, a little bit here, a little bit there. Let people discover things through your fiction that they may not have known something that happened. So that's basically, I stopped looking at my cards a while ago because I'm doing